Okay, since I cannot be in class with you at this moment, I'd like to give you here via video an overview of Reconstruction, which, when we look at the Civil War and Reconstruction together, Reconstruction actually might be more important to us today than the Civil War itself because of the lasting legacies. The failure of Reconstruction created a problem for this country that we had to deal with politically and socially and even somewhat economically for almost an entire century later. So the themes that we will discuss today will come back into our discussion later. So first, I'd like to begin with some very important questions that we have with regards to Reconstruction. The first question is what to do with freedom, right? If Lincoln is going to free the slaves, how do slaves then make the transition from being slaves, where everything is provided for them, where they had no education, where they had no independence, no knowledge of how to provide their own food, clothing, and shelter, to moving into free life, where they are now responsible for everything else? That is a challenge. So as we've already discussed, Lincoln created in 1863 the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the first time the government ever created any type of social welfare agency. As soon as the war was over, remember, white Southerners feared that former slaves would go ransacking plantations and killing whites, and of course that didn't happen. But what they did do is reunited with family members, because remember, the Second Middle Passage, or the internal slave trade, one of the greatest fears of a slave was family separation. And so they traveled around the South looking for family members, trying to reunite with husbands and wives and children. And then as the South, we know, was destroyed as a result of the war. And then there becomes this question of, should former slaves be put to work? There's this famous memo from General Oliver O. Howard that says, we have all these freedmen or former slaves, and they're not doing anything. And we need to farm crops to make sure that we can get through the winter. And there's all of these things that need to be done, and they're refusing to work. Can we force them to work? And of course, his commanders in Washington said, no, that would be slavery. Then, of course, comes the question about, once military occupation happens in the South, how do we keep social order? And by the end of Reconstruction, this question then for former slaves becomes, we don't want to be slaves again, but we have to do some kind of work, because if we don't have work, we don't have money, and if we don't have money, we can't provide for ourselves. And so that need of white Southerners to continue agricultural production, and that need of African Americans to have some type of income to survive, led to the system of sharecropping and tenant farming that you may have already read about. Sharecropping and tenant farming created a system that was very similar to slavery, where African Americans were working some of the same jobs that they had done during slavery, but this time for either very low wages or in a land sharing or crop sharing agreement with the former master that kept them in a perpetual system of debt, which means they never realized true freedom. Another question, of course, is how to rebuild the South, and who's going to pay for this, and how will this be run? We know during military Reconstruction, radical Republicans came into the South and they ran this. They created schools. They built roads. In fact, during Reconstruction, Republican governments, which the only way these state governments turned Republican is because ex-Confederates couldn't vote, but Republican governments actually did accomplish much needed reforms and built a lot of infrastructure. But of course, they're doing that with the majority of the white population having no voting rights whatsoever. And that's going to lead to protest groups and violent protests like the Ku Klux Klan. Over the Thanksgiving holidays, I actually watched that movie, Free State of Jones, which was interesting because it addressed a lot of these themes that we see in Reconstruction. And speaking of that movie, by the way, I did a little research this weekend as well on the backstory of that, and actually the movie touched on some real history and some real problems. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and give it a thumbs up for a historical review on that movie. Okay, well, next, some key political questions. Of course, we discussed this in class. If secession is illegal, How do you legally bring the South back into the Union? If we've never had secession before, then we've never had Reconstruction before, so there's no precedent for this. And then how is the South going to be rebuilt? How do we integrate and protect newly emancipated black freedmen? That's a key political question. What is the government going to do to make sure that the rights of African Americans are not infringed? We know that right after Reconstruction, Southern state governments started passing what were known as black codes. Black codes, immediately passed in 1865, 1866, essentially created a system just like slavery. It took away legal rights of blacks, said they couldn't vote, they couldn't testify in court, that they were restricted to curfews. And of course, when radical Republicans took over with military reconstruction in 1867, they said, okay, that's enough. We're going to suspend those things. And then, of course, who's going to be in charge here? How are we going to deal with violence? How are we going to deal with the KKK is a key political question. And then you always have to have an exit strategy. When and how does Reconstruction end? When do you get to that point where you say, okay, Reconstruction is now accomplished, now we can move on? That's a challenging question in and of itself. So let's look at the timeline of how all this worked. And as I mentioned to you, our plan for today was to go over the phases. So I've labeled these. So this really is all phase one. Lincoln had proposed a 10% plan even before the war was over, which was very, very lenient. That meant that only 10% of the voting population of a southern state would have to swear their allegiance back to the Union for the state to be readmitted. Radical Republicans went crazy over this. They said, 10%, that's it? We've just bled and died fighting these traitors. It better be more than 10% that swears their allegiance. But Lincoln knew that in the long-term vision, it was better to have a fast reunification because he was afraid that a longer process of reunification would lead to bitterness and lead to problems, and then the goals would never be accomplished. And maybe Lincoln was right. Of course, Lincoln's assassinated. And so in the election of 1866, by this point, southern states had been passing those black codes, which restricted the rights of African Americans. And in 1866, southern states started re-electing their former politicians to Congress. So I want you to imagine the scene in Washington, D.C., when the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, walks in the room and says, "Hey guys, I'm back." Can you imagine the outrage of Northern politicians when this happened? Of course, we have a new president this time, Andrew Johnson. Johnson, not as lenient as Lincoln, but certainly not as harsh as everybody wanted him to be. Remember, Johnson was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. We saw this in the President series. And Johnson's plan was just that there had to be a substantial portion of people in the South to pledge allegiance back to the Union. So the state had to agree to allegiance to the Union. Johnson actually was okay with a 50% plan. If 50% of the population pledged allegiance and they ratified the 13th Amendment ending slavery, they could come back in. And so Johnson actually does this on his own. Congress was out of session, so Johnson just starts readmitting southern states. Southern states start sending congressmen and senators to come back into Congress. And so when the new Congress, after the election of 1866, comes in January 1867, they go, what in the world has happened here? And so they take over. Now, Congress had already been working on a Civil Rights Act in 1866, which was intended to guarantee the rights of African Americans and overrule the black codes. But Congress realized once they saw Johnson readmitting states, they couldn't just sit around and wait and let Johnson control this mess. And so they imposed what's known as military reconstruction, where all the southern states are thrown back out of the Union. So even if Johnson's readmitted them, sorry, you're out. And the South was divided into 5 military districts. And it's during military reconstruction that the that Union troops will enforce laws to protect African Americans. This, of course, we look at the goals, becomes 1, punish the South. The South needs to be a conquered territory. Johnson did not believe it should be a conquered territory. radical Republicans in Congress did. They wanted to ensure racial equality and certainly limit the influence of President Johnson. So as we look at this timeline, what happens during radical Reconstruction? Well, Congress passes a 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees the right of citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Now, the purpose of this was that southern states were limiting the rights of African Americans. So how do you guarantee that all citizens in our country, white or black, are being treated equally before the law? So they write this amendment that says that essentially all persons born or naturalized in the United States, that removes the racial barrier, are equal before the law. Interesting, by the way, implication for today, this is what has created the procedure of birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship is the idea that if you're born here, you're a citizen. Other countries don't work this way. My wife and I can't go to Germany, have a baby in Germany, and have that baby be a German citizen. But here in the United States, somebody could illegally immigrate to the United States, have a baby here, and that child becomes a citizen. So interesting loophole that was created. It was this is not what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended, but it's something that we deal with today. As part of radical Reconstruction, states had to write new state constitutions. Of course, all during this process, ex-Confederates could not vote. Former slaves could vote. So imagine, we've talked about the South as having this social pyramid with slaves at the bottom and rich white plantation owners at the top. Now, the social order has been turned upside down. And so that leads to violence like the Ku Klux Klan, right? Because ex-Confederates, they don't have any political rights, so they're going to get their rights elsewhere. This is also the period that Johnson deals with the impeachment crisis. We saw that in the President series. And Johnson really, as a failed president, there's no way he's going to even be considered in 1868. And in 1868, the Union ticket or the Republican ticket is led by the former General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is seen as almost like the savior who's going to bring in change. And he does initially. The Congress writes a 15th Amendment during Grant's presidency. The 15th Amendment guarantees all persons the right to vote. All men the right to vote regardless of race. And of course, during radical Reconstruction, the military is going to ensure that blacks actually have the right to vote in the South. So these political cartoons kind of show some of the reactions of the South and kind of what was happening in the South. Radical Republicans who moved to the South were known as carpetbaggers because they carried their belongings on a carpet bag, not looked at very fondly by Southerners. And of course, this image asks the question, during Reconstruction, did it become worse than slavery? Because of the White League and because of the KKK, were slaves worse off during Reconstruction because of oppression, because of violence, than they were during slavery itself? Interesting thought for you to discuss. So Grant, of course, as you saw in the President series, does effectively deal with the Klan. He sends troops and crushes the Klan. But then the scandals come about. And in 1872, of course, the country has bigger issues to deal with. Industry, Indian wars, westward expansion, more corruption and problems. And so the emphasis and the focus on Reconstruction really begins to fade. Congress passes an Amnesty Act where they pardon ex-Confederates, which means former members of the Confederacy don't have to go to jail. And frankly, people in the North are just sick and tired of paying for it and hearing about it. The country wants to move on. And so Reconstruction comes to an end with the election of 1876, which we're going to actually save this discussion for tomorrow because I want to get into this a little bit more in depth. And we'll talk about, again, why Reconstruction fades tomorrow. So some lasting legacies before I conclude. Overall, Reconstruction is a failure. We see a takeover by white redeemers. Those were whites who took back the South. And the end result is 100 years of segregation and discrimination. Okay, Thank you for listening.